Good evening. And welcome. I'm Don Gibson, and the coordinator of this event on behalf of the Oklahoma Institute for Biblical Literacy, an organization that had its beginning only 4 or 5 years ago. I hope that you will view our gathering tonight in the spirit that this is a continuing part of our journey toward the common good. I'm delighted to tell you that we have participants that came as far away from the north as Lawrence, Kansas, and south to Waxahachie, Texas, and from Louisville, Kentucky, and I started to say Elk City, and then I was reminded that we have someone from El Dorado, New Mexico. So, we're well represented. To give perspective for our purpose for coming together, I want to quote 2 sentences that occur early in Dr. Brueggemann's book by the title of this the lectureship. He said, "The great crisis among us is the crisis of the common good, the sense of community solidarity that binds all in a common destiny. Mature people at their best are people committed to the common good that reaches beyond their private interests, transcends sectarian commitments, and offers human solidarity." The reason for our gathering is to listen and learn, communicate, and discuss what that means in practical terms for us as led under the wisdom provided by Dr. Brueggemann. Let me also say that I want to recognize the founder of the Institute of Biblical Literacy, and I'd like to ask Dr. Robert Elliott and his wife, Harriet, would you stand and would you greet them and thank you? To speak briefly on behalf of the Institute. Byron, please.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. It is my task, very briefly, when we were in board meeting a couple weeks ago, they placed the mantle upon me to get you all to become members of the OPI. Reluctantly, I said yes, but that entails giving up some funds. I don't know how that was a great task of mine. But let me tell you, the OPIL is a great organization. Howard Thurman said that the best of the Christian church will be operated with both head and heart. And so it is our task as we need to bring in the best theologians, the brightest theologians to Oklahoma to make them, expose them to Oklahomans and even those outside of this state. We are a wonderful organization, a new organization. I've been a board member for probably just under a year, and it is our task to enhance biblical scholarship within the state of Oklahoma. It's our task to raise critical questions within the context of biblical scholarship, as well as expose many people to different theologians, as well as scholars from across this country. You were given several sheets of paper when you came in. One of those was a membership fee. In order for us to do the things that we do, bringing Dr. Brueggemann and others, we need your support. Once again, this is a wonderful organization trying its best to raise the level of critical intellectual thought in Oklahoma regarding biblical scholarship. And so it's our task to ask you, if you would like to become a member of the OBIL, you can see that form that was handed to you. It's a $20 annual membership fee. But not only that, we have coming in November of this year, the author of Paradise and Soul Repair, Rita Brock, should be coming this November. So we want you to make you aware of that We really want you to participate and support this organization. Once again, it's a great organization. Reverend Elliott has done a wonderful job leading it, trying to raise the awareness in the state of Oklahoma regarding biblical scholarship. I think you will enjoy the presentation tonight and look forward to what we will bring you in November. Thank you.
When I began to search for a congregation to host this event, I contacted Reverend David Spain here at First Christian Church in Norman. Initially, I came to only ask him if he would lead his congregation in becoming one of the contributors to this event. And I'd like to call to your attention that listing of congregations and agencies that have been contributors to this particular event. Well, when I told David that we had Dr. Brueggemann scheduled as guest lecturer, his eyes got bigger, and his smile got bigger, and he said, "Can we host this event?" And my job was now well done, wasn't it? A contributor, yes indeed. And I want to say that we are indeed grateful for and appreciate very much the ministry of this congregation, the leadership of David Spain. And if I had all of the members of this congregation stand, well, let's do that. I want you to see how many of the members of this congregation are behind and involved and here tonight in this event. Now, would you also welcome Senior Pastor Reverend David Spain for his welcome and introduction of our guest lecturer.
I noticed those who stood up were members of this congregation, and where they're seated tonight, they don't sit that close on Sunday mornings. Tonight we are indeed delighted to welcome Dr. Brueggemann to this city and this venue. After his lecture, there will be the opportunity for you to ask questions, and there is a microphone down here in front, and you are asked to come down and give your question, making it as brief and concise as possible so that we can field as many questions as possible. After tonight's lecture, you are invited to the fellowship hall of the church where Dr. Brueggemann will be and where he will be signing books. There's also a reception available to you and the opportunity for you to talk more informally. Tomorrow morning's session begins at 9:15 here in this sanctuary, but at 8:45 the fellowship hall will be open and we will be serving a breakfast, and you are certainly invited to come and participate in that. And of course the bookstore will also be open at that time as well. So many of you, like me, have quoted Dr. Brueggemann either through preaching or teaching, and so it's a pleasure one more time for me to quote Dr. Brueggemann, his words by way of his introduction. Walter Brueggemann is the William Marcellus McPheeters Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is a past president of the Society of Biblical Literature and an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. He has recently written Disruptive Grace, David and His Theologian, and the Practice of Prophetic Imagination. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Walter Brueggemann?
Friday night with you and Saturday morning with some of you. And Dawn and David have been steadfast pen pals for a while now with email. And I am glad to be invited to this
and glad to be in this great church. The United Church of Christ are kissing cousins with the disciples of Christ, so that feels a little bit of homecoming. I was born in Nebraska and grew up in Missouri, so spent my growing up years being frightened of the Oklahoma Sooners. My memories go back to the Big Six, or the Big 8 and the Big 12, and what's it back down to 6 now or something? They're all in Texas. Anyway, I'm delighted to be with you, and Don asked me to talk out of my book, The Journey of the Common Good, and while my thinking has been at this a while, it is clear about the events just in Boston that nurture and the practice of the common good is enormously important to us, and it is a continuing task and a continuing problem for us. What we are witnessing in our society is the disintegration of the common good, a lack of civic engagement and civil behavior, a refusal to join any associations that keep people connected, and an inability to mobilize our enormous assets for the sake of the neighborhood through policy and through regulation. So what we live with now is an imagined individualism that works against the common good, all the way from rugged individualism that wants to organize our power into militia, or I don't know whether they say it in Oklahoma, but they say it in many places, I want to be spiritual and not religious, which means I don't want to have any obligations and I don't want to have any tradition and I don't want to have to be accountable in any communal setting, or the idea that we might be self-made people as though we just invented ourselves one day without the nurture of a community. So the Bible is the primary root not only of the notion of the common good, but of the practice of the common good, and the church is the primary advocate in our society for the common good of neighborliness. Indeed, we might conclude that the nurture of the common good is a primary mission of the church, if we remember that the love of God only can take form of a love of a neighbor. So, for example, in Jeremiah 22, in one of the zinger texts of the Old Testament, Jeremiah is criticizing the power people in the society who do not care about the common good. And then he cites the good King Josiah as an example of the common good and says that he took care of the poor and the needy. And then Jeremiah says, or God says to Jeremiah, is this not to know me? To know me, God, is to care for the neighborhood. And I think a big struggle in our society, which is inordinately religious, is the question of how we keep love of God and love of neighbor together. So I imagine that we are always learning to reread the Bible in all kinds of new circumstances. And I think now that our task in trying to read the Bible is to try to sort that out against a kind of fundamentalism that doesn't really care about the common good on the one hand, and on the other hand, the kind of progressives who are really embarrassed about the Bible and want to have it as little as possible. To find a way between those two temptations in the church is not easy, so that will be my project for these hours that we may be able to spend together. And I want to suggest to you that the story in the book of Exodus, wilderness, Sinai, is the most elemental paradigmatic narrative of the common good, and it is a journey. So the title of my book, Journey to the Common Good, is a journey from Egypt through the wilderness to Mount Sinai and a covenant with God. That story basically begins with reference to Pharaoh, who embodies and practices hostility to the common good. And as you may know, historians have spent a great deal of energy trying to figure out who Pharaoh is. Might be Ramses, might be Emeritus, all kinds of names, but we can't figure it out. And it's so interesting that the Bible has no interest in telling us Pharaoh's name. And the reason for that is if you see one Pharaoh, you see all. So maybe Pharaoh was an historical person, but what has happened in the process of the biblical narrative is that he has become a metaphor for a predatory society, and he is a predator. So what we have to try to figure out is how to serve the common good in a society that is organized around predatory economics. And the Bible takes some pain to trace this out with Pharaoh. The first time we meet Pharaoh is in Genesis 12, the very first chapter of Abraham and Sarah. There is a famine, and Pharaoh has got all the food, so they go to Egypt to get food. And then in Genesis 41, Pharaoh has a nightmare. Our translations call it a dream. It's a nightmare. And it is high irony that the guy with the most is the one who has a nightmare. So he has this nightmare about 7 fat cows being eaten by 7 lean cows, and 7 good stalks of grain being eaten by 7 poor stalks of grain. I don't know how a stalk of grain can eat a stalk of grain, but that's what he did. And his intelligence community can't interpret the dream, because intelligence communities tend not to get anything important. That's what I put that in. So finally, if you want to know what your dreams mean, you have to find a Jew. Because Jews are these people who live at many levels. See, Freud did all that because Freud took that legacy of Jewishness, and they finally found a Jew, and he was in prison as an enemy of the state, so they cleaned him up, and Joseph came in and said, oh, you just had a dream. You had 2 dreams about a famine. You had a nightmare that you're going to run out of food. This man who had all the food. So he said to Joseph, what do you think I ought to do? And Joseph said, you ought to appoint a food czar who's really smart. And Pharaoh says, you got any candidates? And then Joseph pulled a Dick Cheney and said, yes, I nominate me. And Dick Cheney became vice president. And by Genesis 47, it says that Pharaoh had all the food. So he started with anxiety about scarcity, and he accumulated until he arrived at a monopoly. And that chapter, which we will never read in church, because it's too practical, says that in the first year of the famine, the peasants came to get food. He sold the food. It didn't occur to him to give them food, because that would have been welfare. And the second year they came for food, he said, well, you don't have any money, I'll take your cattle. And if you take cattle from peasants, you put them out of business. The third year they came, and he said, you don't have any money, you don't have any cattle, I don't know what to do. And they said, take our bodies and take our land and make us your slaves. And by the end of the paragraph, they say, thank you so much for letting us be your slaves. And then you turn 2 pages in your Bible, and you're in the book of Exodus. We read the book of Exodus, but we never wonder how they got into slavery. They got into slavery because a predatory society placed all the money, all the food, all the supplies at the top of the pyramid. So people at the bottom had such debts. Does it sound contemporary? Had such debts that they couldn't make their way and they became bond servants to the guy who was running a pyramid club. And if you read one page into the book of Exodus, what you'll read is violence. It says that Pharaoh treated his slaves ruthlessly and exploited them. So the sequence is anxiety, scarcity, accumulation, monopoly, violence. That's the map of the world in which the gospel then appears. So the Exodus narrative is a study of how you live in that kind of society and how you depart from that kind of society. That's what the word Exodus means. You know, it means departure, because Pharaoh's society was a society of endless production, of 24/7 anxiety, of multitasking, of making more bricks. And the reason Pharaoh needed more bricks was to build more granaries to store his food monopoly. So they were contributing to storing the food monopoly to which they had no access. That's called cheap labor. Now the counter story, which is the story that is entrusted to the synagogue and to the church, is about the dawning of an alternative. And you can see in the early chapters of the book of Exodus, there is this slow getting ready to depart. The first people who think about departure are these midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. And what's so astonishing, we know their names. We don't know the names of any Pharaoh, but we know the names of the two midwives who defied Pharaoh, and they just get birthing Hebrew babies because the force was with them. And the second getting ready for departure at the end of Exodus 2, it says when that Pharaoh died, everything came unglued. When that Pharaoh died, the Israelites groaned and cried out for being exploited. They just cried out. They didn't cry out to anyone. They just cried out to say, we can't take this and it's not right and we're not going to put up with it. So that hope. See, Pharaoh doesn't care if you're hurt as long as you don't cry out about it. But the text says that the cry came up to the God of the gospel because the God of the gospel is like a magnet that draws the cries of the oppressed who have to live under Pharaoh. And so Yahweh, the God of Israel, gets mobilized by the cries of the oppressed. And Yahweh says, I have heard your cry, I have seen your condition, I know how it is with you, I have come down and I have remembered and I will deliver you. So it says this, I will do this for you. And then in Exodus 3:10, after this big recital of first person self-announcements, Yahweh says to Moses, you go to Pharaoh. That's how it works. So divine purpose is lived out through human agency. God has a will, God has a purpose, God has an intention that bends the arc of history that is long toward justice, but it requires human agents. Now if you think about holy intention and human agent being bound together, if you're a Christian, you're eventually going to think about truly God, truly human, because in Jesus of Nazareth, the divine purpose and the human agent are melded and indivisible. But they almost already are in Moses, because Moses is this guy who will do this. And then in that funny narrative that we call the plague cycle, it's like a contest in which Pharaoh's intelligence community, that we weekly translate magicians, all intelligence communities are essentially magicians. And Moses and Aaron, they play anything I can do, you can do better. So we're trying to find out who has the power for life. And the first contest is turning water to blood, and they play that to a draw. The second contest is about flies, and they play that to a draw. Now listen, when you get to the third contest, the third plague, the third smiting, that's what the word means, it says that Moses and Aaron made gnats. And then the Pharaoh's agents tried to make gnats. They couldn't make gnats, which means that Pharaoh's apparatus had reached the limit of its capacity to perform. Can you imagine the news that went through the slave community when the word got out, Pharaoh has reached his limit? Now the reason that one little verse in chapter 8 seems so important to me is that we now live in a time when it's clear to us that the military technological enterprise has reached its limit, and it cannot make us safe, and it cannot make us happy. It can't even make gnats. So we have all of that apparatus, and now we've witnessed again that we've not been made safe. And the indices of unhappiness in our society are enormous. So what the Bible begins to play with is that there must be an alternative way to happiness and safety if the technological apparatus of Pharaoh can't deliver that for us. Now, there are two other interesting texts as you read through the plagues. Did you ever wonder why there are 10 of them, or did you know there were 10 of them? Well, there are 10 of them. There's a little clue about why there are 10. And there could have been 7, or there could have been 3, or there could have been 15. It's probably to match the 10 Commandments. But in chapter 10, it says, we're telling this story of all these plagues in order that you may tell your grandchildren what a fool Yahweh made of Pharaoh, in order that your grandchildren may learn to fear Yahweh. What those verses mean, it's a curriculum. It's a Sunday school curriculum, and it lasts 10 Sundays. If you just did it 2 Sundays, the kids might not notice, so you got to stretch it out and do it over and over, because there's really only one Sunday school lesson. And you just have to find many, many different ways to perform it. And then when you reach chapter 12, the end of the plague cycle, this is when the angel of death kills everybody in Egypt. And Pharaoh has been trying to keep them from departing his system. Finally comes to Moses in the middle of the night and said, please go, please leave. Please take your cattle and your flocks and your herds and your boys and your girls. Just take everybody and please leave. And then he says, the last time he gets to speak, oh, before you go, bless me. Can you imagine this great Pharaoh coming to this nobody of a slave, say, I perceive now that you are the carrier of God's blessing for life that I don't have, and I need to receive it from you. I think the parallel in the gospel narrative is that Roman soldier late Friday night at the cross. He witnessed the execution of Jesus by the empire. And then he says, late, too late, this was the Son of God. So the gospel narrative wants to say at late Friday night, the Roman Empire noticed that this is the presence of God in the life of the world. That God's power does not abide with Pharaoh, it does not abide with Rome, it does not abide with any of the pyramid clubs that seem to be monopolizing the power for life. So they are on their journey, having figured out that the regime of Pharaoh cannot keep its promise of safety or of happiness. And so the narrative says that they went through the waters, and when they came out on the other side, Miriam and the other women took their tambourines and they danced and they sang, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. That's what congregational singing is all about. Every time we gather to sing the songs of praise, we sing the songs to the God of life because we entertain for a moment that we have departed the grip of Pharaoh and of Rome and of all those predatory systems that rob us of our dignity and our freedom and our capacity to live. So what they did was to depart the steady food supply of Pharaoh, and they walked into the wilderness where there was no food. And the way the story works, they danced and sang in chapter 15, and 2 verses into chapter 16, they said, let's go back. Because Pharaoh's way of characterizing our life and our imagination has a huge grip on us. So wouldn't it be terrific in the church if all the liberals and all the conservatives agreed that our journey is to leave Pharaoh's system and to admit in each other's presence we don't really want to go. We rather like this slave system that keeps us from being our full selves in a full neighborhood of the common good. And you know how that works. Chapter 16 is bitch. They don't have any meat, they don't have any bread, they don't have any water. Why don't you bring us out here to die? And that's what it's like every time we entertain the thought that we might organize our life outside of Pharaoh's domain. Because Pharaoh's got all the jobs, Pharaoh's got all the mortgage money, Pharaoh's got all the church budgets. Pharaoh's got everything we need, everything we want. And finally God is so fed up and says to Moses, all right, I'll get bread. Now this is a weird story about bread from heaven. It's a very flaky story. How else would you tell a story about bread that is not baked in Pharaoh's ovens? It's got to be odd bread. And did you know the word manna means what is it? They call it, what is it, bread? They wondered about it, so they call it wonder bread. And the narrative says that some gathered a little and some gathered a lot, and everybody had what they needed, and Moses said, don't store it up. But they stored it up because they thought they might have a pyramid on their hands. So they stored it up, and then it spoiled, it got worms, it melted, and it smelled bad. It's all three of those things. It melted, it got worms, and it smelled bad. Any one of them would have done. We want to get the point. Store it up. And then by chapter 19, they arrived at Mount Sinai, which was an awesome, scary place. And Moses says, God has Moses say to them, if, big conditional, if, it's a kind of a Calvinist if, nothing's cheap. If you will listen to my voice, and if you will keep my covenant, if you obey the commandments, you can be like people. You could be a priestly nation that spends your life interceding for the light of the world. That's in Exodus 19:6. I want you to get this sequence. The Ten Commandments are given in chapter 20. You probably know that. The Bible probably just falls open to it. Before you get to the Ten Commandments, in 19:8, they say, all the commandments that God's going to give us, we will obey all of them. We're ready. We're going to be obedient. Now, I've thought a long time about why did they say that before they knew what the commandments were? They signed a blank check. They signed a blank check. And I think the reason they signed a blank check for the commandments of Mount Sinai is that they anticipated that whatever commandments this liberating God gives will be better than the commandments of Pharaoh. So your handout, take a look at your handout. You got Pharaoh's 10 Commandments, right? These 10 Commandments are all quotes from Exodus 5. They're all there. Make more bricks. Make more bricks without straw. Get to your work. Make more bricks. You are lazy. Lazy. Make more bricks. Make more bricks. 10 Commandments. I could have made it 12 or 15 or 7, but 10 is a good number. You know anything about those 10 Commandments? Work harder. Save more. Get more members. Write more articles. Do you know your T number? Have more erections. Everything is a command performance of endless productivity and endless consumption because everything is reduced to a commodity. Everything is reduced to everybody is for sale. Everything can be bought and sold and purchased and traded and hoarded. That's what Pharaoh commands. That isn't how we experience it. What we experience is, I don't have time. I don't have time to get the kids to soccer practice. I certainly don't have time for a church meeting. I'm exhausted. I don't have time. Because what do you get, 118 emails a day? Or you can't look up in the restroom from your phone to speak to the person across the table from you? See, so Pharaoh's commandments are not ancient. Pharaoh's commandments are as contemporary as today. And liberals and conservatives are all caught in them. Because you have to measure up, you have to do more, you have to be more, you have to have more, you have to own more. I don't watch a lot of television, but you can hardly get away from ads for cosmetics and drugs. With more cosmetics and more drugs, you get fixed so that you can perform better. Or you maybe can exercise more, or whatever. I think that's what was going on in 1908 when they said, we'll try his commandments. So they got 10. There was recently, I used to live in Georgia, a legislator who wanted to have the 10 commandments put up in every school, in every courtroom, in every city park. And some journalist said, sir, do you know the 10 commandments? He said, well, there's one in there about adultery. I think that's the only one I remember. So it has occurred to me that the 10 commandments are 10 anti-Pharaoh commandments. I have come to think for myself and for people I know that the fourth commandment on Sabbath is the most important and the most difficult of the commandments because it means to stop being productive. There were no Sabbaths in Pharaoh's Egypt, not for the slaves, not for the taskmasters, not for the supervisors, not for Pharaoh. I bet Pharaoh was watching his monitor all day to see how the brick production was going. So keeping Sabbath is an act of defiance against the pressures that are imposed on us. And before the fourth commandment, I'm not going to go through all 10. The second commandment says, you shall not make a graven image of a god. You shall not engage in commodity fetishism. You shall not value things and worship them. Now before he finishes, Moses has God say, or God has Moses say, you shall not covet. You shall not engage in acquisitiveness to acquire more and more and more. And only recently have I noticed that the 10th commandment, Exodus 20 verse 17, I think it is, has the word neighbor in it 3 times. What a way in the 10 commandments. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor, 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 neighbor. There were no neighbors in Pharaoh's Egypt. There were only rivals and competitors and threats. But we don't hardly know how to do neighbor. But clearly the only way you can have a safe marathon is to create neighborliness. To create neighborliness in which everybody is looking out for everybody. And you slowly engraft into the neighborly fabric all the people that are frightened of neighborliness. So, Exodus 12 and 13 are this detailed, punctilious keeping of Passover. Passover is the re-performance of the Exodus narrative, and I suspect in much Jewish practice it becomes so stylized that you do not notice the radicality of it. But it's simply an acknowledgement that the narrative has to be re-performed over and over and over. So the Exodus journey is a geographical journey of leaving Egypt for a promised land. But there are not many of those on offer unless you go to New Zealand, I guess, or someplace. But we also know, I worship in an Episcopalian church, and Episcopalians are very good at praise. You know, everywhere is a procession. And we need 3 Episcopalians to make a procession. So the performance of the Exodus is essentially a liturgical event. So this is our Passover meal in which we drank the juice of freedom and eat the bread of the wilderness. Comes right out of Passover. Or what if the performance of Exodus is not simply geographical and not simply liturgical, but what if it is emotional? What if it is emotional emancipation from all of the expectations that our society has imposed upon us, starting with our mothers and our fathers? Our mothers and fathers did good for us, but they also nurtured us into kind of conformity expectations. And we carry those and carry those and carry those until through a lot of hard work and honesty and self-awareness, we might even say free at last about that. But what if it's geographical, what if it's liturgical, what if it's emotional, and what if it's economic? What if it's economic, saying, I don't have to serve completely Pharaoh's economy of development and growth and acquisitiveness. Did you see the op-ed piece in the New York Times earlier this week? Is about a new book by Michael Pollan, who's the big food guy, and the headline says, Pollan cooks. And his new book, apparently I haven't seen the book, says that if you want a way to health outside the economy that's going to kill you, cook. Because if you cook your own food, rather than buying it off of Pharaoh's food chain, you'll eat healthier, etc., etc., etc. So what we're trying to figure out and trying to make little moves towards to say there is another way to organize our life that comes close to being a neighborhood. So my read on the Exodus, wilderness, Sinai, and the narrative is insistent. You can't just go from Exodus to Sinai, but we got to somehow go through that wilderness experience. It is now the market ideology. Probably a good thing we're talking about this in the wake of Margaret Thatcher's death. It is the market ideology that is choking our common life. I think we need a market. Nobody's arguing about that. But market ideology wants to claim that the practice of the market can be the ultimate narrative of our life, and it cannot be the ultimate narrative of our life. So the market ideology means getting ahead of your neighbor, having more, and making sure that nobody gets any free lunch. So the market ideology wants to shrink generosity toward the neighbor, wants to privatize, wants to make sure that everything I got belongs to me and not the neighborhood. So the market ideology makes a virtue of greed. The market ideology generates incredible anxiety. You don't ever have enough. Market ideology generates anxiety and leaves us exhausted without moral courage. So given this text, this whole text that springs from the Exodus narrative, my sense about the meeting that takes place in this room and in many rooms like this regularly is that we gather to re-perform the narrative and to have the kind of quiet, self-reflective pace that haunts us as we think together about alternatives. So some people who gather regularly know But some people who gather know we're about to fall off the wagon. Some people arrive exhausted and can hardly engage. Some people arrive skeptically and say, what have you got? Have you got anything new for us today? And then we say these words about the meal of emancipation, that in the same night in which he was arrested by the empire as an enemy of the state, he gave the bread of life. If you think about that, that's as flaky as bread from heaven. Bread of life and the cup of salvation and the new cup. I don't think that departure from Pharaoh is abrupt. I don't think it's sudden. I don't think it's dramatic for most of us. I think it's a slow process of coming to ourselves. It's a slow process of coming to ourselves, like that second son in Luke 15. He came to himself. How we translate it. He had a glimpse of sanity, and he said, this isn't my place. My place is with my dad. I'm going home. And he was welcomed home. So Jesus performs the Exodus narrative. He provides emancipation for widows and orphans and lepers and lame people and all kinds of dysfunctional people. He offers the bread of abundance, 5,000 and then 4,000. And then he lays on his followers the disciplines of walking with him. It's the same story. And you know that if he fed 5,000, he had 12 basketful left over. He fed 7,000, he had 4,000, he had 7 baskets left over. There's this funny little verse hidden in the Gospel of Mark. It's in Mark 6:52. It just sits there all by itself. And it says that the disciples did not understand about the bread. They didn't understand about manna. They didn't understand about Eucharist. They didn't understand the miracle of 5,000, 4,000, 12 baskets. They didn't understand about abundance. And the reason Mark says they didn't understand about abundance is that their hearts were hard. Now, if I say to you their hearts are hard, what are you supposed to think of it? Pharaoh's the guy with the hard heart. They didn't understand the new economy of abundance because they thought like Pharaoh. They thought scarcity. They thought anxiety. They thought accumulation. They thought monopoly. So it is with us. Robert Withnow, the great sociologist of religion, who writes really important, really boring books. He's done a study of stewardship sermons. And he says, preachers preach great stewardship sermons, but nobody hears them. Nobody hears them because we listen with our Pharaoh ears. And so the preacher talks abundance, and we hear parsimony. Jesus performs abundance, and we're afraid of not enough bread to go around. So we better bake some more. So now I will finish to say this text just sits in the middle of our failed economy. It just sits there. But it is infused with the Spirit. And I have no doubt that the Spirit is inviting us through the text to use our best energy and our best imagination, our best thinking in quite specific, concrete, local ways. Or how we can perform our life outside of the predatory system. We do make gestures, and the church is better at that than anybody else. But we make only modest gestures. And it could be in this Easter season that our hearts are melting from their hardness. And we will make this incredible move out of the kingdom of scarcity into God's creation of abundance. Because God is the gift who keeps on giving.